We have here verse 22 of the second chapter of John's Gospel. We're finishing up the story in which Jesus has indicated that if this temple were to be destroyed, he would raise it up in 3 days. The incredulous response of the religious leaders, of course, pointing out it had taken 46 years to build that temple, is met by the explanatory comment provided by John that Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. And now John continues that explanation, because John, of course, was there at the time that this conversation took place and was certainly present later when a more profound understanding of Jesus' words finally dawned on them, which was, of course, much later in the history of these events. And that's what John is commenting on now. Hota, adverb, indeclinable, when, therefore, egerthe. This is the third person singular passive indicative. So when he was raised, ek nekron, the idiomatic way in Greek of saying from the dead, from among the dead, plural really, but it's translated typically, he was raised up from the dead, referring to Jesus. Then we have emnesthesan, from the word memnesko. We had this a little bit earlier. This is the third person plural passive indicative, and it suggests that something was brought to the memory of the disciples. So his disciples, hoi mathetai autou, the disciples of him, had brought to their memory, as if it were something that was imposed upon them or brought to them somehow. They passively came to understand it because it was simply impressed upon their minds. It's sort of the texture of the way it's stated here. So when he was raised from the dead, the disciples had brought to their mind, hoti, tuto, that, this, elegen, again in the imperfect, third person singular, that this he was saying, kai, epistusan, and third person plural, aorist, active indicative, they believed, te graphe, singular, dative, they believed the Scripture, or believe, dative of reference with reference to the Scripture, singular, by the way, which probably means not a particular Scripture of the Old Testament, but rather the Scripture taken as a whole, which in its general drift was pointing toward the idea that there would be a fully vindicated Messiah who would rise from the dead and become this new and living temple that was the subject of the earlier conversation. So they believed the Scripture kai to logo, again, dative of reference, and they believed with reference to the logos, the word, to logo, dative, which, relative pronoun, accusative, which, apen, he said, ho Jesus, which Jesus said. The idea here is that they had some idea what Jesus meant even at the time he said it, but of course much later, especially after Jesus rose from the dead, and especially after the much more extensive teaching that they had received from him, they had a much more profound understanding of what he was saying in that original setting when he cleansed the temple the first time, and thus it came to them with a greater force and clarity, the significance of that conversation.